Då hälsar vi dig hjärtligt välkommen till veckans avsnitt av BibelPodden. Och vi som sitter i studion idag är jag, Per Evert.
Och jag, Malin Davidsson.
Ja, nu har vi ju kört några veckor det här programmet.
Ja.
Hur känns det, som vi brukar säga?
Jo, men det känns roligt, spännande och det känns som att vi bara får mer och mer idéer till nya avsnitt. Så hur ska vi få plats med allt på ett år?
Ja, det är ju härliga positiva problem att vi har mycket uppslag.
Ja.
Hur tyckte du?
För dig då?
Ja, precis. Det är lite mixat sådär. Att man är lite nervös när man sätter igång ett nytt program. Kommer någon att titta eller lyssna överhuvudtaget? Man börjar liksom på noll.
Ja.
Men det var ju faktiskt rätt många som hängde med från början.
Ja, det är ju roligt.
Ja.
Det är bra.
Så att vi får väl göra vårt bästa helt enkelt för att ta tillvara det förtroende som vi har med de som lyssnar. Och
det får vi göra.
Ja, presentera bra och sakligt material om Bibeln. Det är det som är vårt huvudfokus.
Ja, det är målet. Har du fått några kommentarer eller?
Ja, det får man ju. Ja. Mycket påhejande. Ja. Och de som inte är påhejande, de kanske inte vill säga någonting. Men det går ju att skriva kommentarer till de här programmen.
Det får gärna lyssnare och tittare göra.
Precis.
Skriva kommentarer och önska och skriva frågor och sånt.
Ja,
det får man gärna göra.
Vi vill ju gärna få input.
Ja.
Både kanske i form av programidéer eller intervjupersoner och frågor också. Ja.
Precis.
Sen vill vi gärna både göra olika saker i det här programmet. Dels att uppmuntra positiva saker som händer och liksom uppmuntra dem. Och också titta på saker som dyker upp i debatten som inte är bra, så vi får kommentera det och hjälpa folk. Har du hängt med här i bibeldebatterna som var i slutet på 2025 och början på 2026?
Ja, men man hänger ju med lite grann. Det sägs och pratas lite i medierna.
Ja, en debatt som var mycket i slutet på förra året var ju den om Josef. Hängde du med någonting i den?
Jag tycker den går lite över huvudet på mig. Men det är ju bra om vi har nördar då som du som kan ta i den.
Ja. Och jag tänker att vi kanske får möjlighet att återkomma till det ämnet i en senare program. För jag håller på att fiska lite. Det finns en Josef-forskare i ett annat land som jag gärna skulle vilja ha som gäst i det här programmet och kunna gå på djupet om Josef-berättelsen.
Det låter spännande tycker jag.
Ja. Sen kommenterar vi ju den från Klapphamninstitutet och 3 GT-forskare skrev en artikel där de kritiserar det som den här GT-professorn skrev som inte var sakligt om Josef.
Det är bra.
Ja. Och sen när det var jul så dök det upp saker också som det ofta gör kring de stora högtiderna.
Ja.
Hörde du på Jonas Gardells julsaga?
Jag hörde inte hela för att det var inte riktigt till mig tror jag. Hörde du hela?
Vad ska man svara på det? Ja, men det var ju inte bra. Inte om det ska vara en kreativ mytologisk beskrivning om varför djävulen är den goda gestalten. Då var det väl okej. Ja. Men det var ju inte den bibliska historien.
Det är kanske inte riktigt det som vi vill höra när vi ska fira Jesu födelse.
Nej, jag tycker det var osakligt av Sveriges Radio att ge den plattformen till en som uppenbart drev en helt annan agenda där han ville liksom marknadsföra sin egen filosofi och teologi snarare än att beskriva den bibliska berättelsen. Så den kan vi inte rekommendera.
Nej, det kan vi inte göra. Nej.
Men poängen med det här programmet är ju att vi vill gärna rekommendera saker som är bra.
Ja, det vill vi göra.
Och ett sånt exempel är ju alla de satsningar som satts igång på att använda Bibeln det här året. Läsa Bibeln. Och då tänkte vi ta ett litet samtal nu.
Ja, det tänkte vi göra. Vi tänkte ringa upp en person.
Som heter Mikael Wahl som har satt igång en satsning om att läsa Bibeln på 40 dagar. Hela Bibeln.
Det är en bibelutmaning.
Ja.
Har du hakat på? Är du på eller?
Nej, utan vi har så många andra bibelutmaningar. Vi vill gärna välsigna andra som gör andra.
Ja, det vill vi.
Så vi kan väl göra så att vi kopplar in honom och hör hur det har gått med den här satsningen helt enkelt.
Det ska vi göra. Hej Mikael, är du med oss?
Hej, japp.
Ja, du hör oss, vad bra. Du vet kanske inte vem jag är, men jag sitter här med Per i den här nya BibelPodden. Och vi är så nyfikna på dig och din bibelutmaning. Vill du berätta lite först, vem är du?
Jag heter Mikael Wahl. Jag är nationell ledare för Kings Kids Sverige som har funnits i 30-40 år. Och vi jobbar med många saker i utsatta områden. Framförallt ett där jag bor, Hässleholmen heter det. Ja. Och sen så är jag intresserad av Bibeln i allmänhet. Och så.
Ja. Kul. Och det här med, jag har ju sett själv flimra förbi i flödet på Facebook någonting om en bibelutmaning, Mikaels bibelutmaning. Vad är det för någonting?
idén föddes i juni någon gång att men nu måste jag läsa igenom hela Bibeln. Och sen inser jag är ju inte bra på disciplin. Så då tänkte jag måste få med mig några till så jag inte är själv. Och sen gick jag ut i december med detta att nu kör vi 3 januari. 40 dagar. Vilka är på liksom så vi kan stötta varandra. Så vi blev 130 personer. Det är
130
jätteroligt.
personer, det är ändå ett helt gäng ju.
Det är ett stort gäng.
Ja.
Och Dagen hörde av sig. Kan du inte skriva en insändare? Ja, kan jag väl göra. Så det fick vi göra och så hängde några till på. Så det var kul.
Ja, men kul. Har du, nu när vi spelar in det här så har du ju gått någon vecka i alla fall. Har du någon erfarenhet du vill dela med dig av?
Vi har läst hälften ikväll när vi är klara med dagen. Så det är roligt. Det är små nya insikter hela tiden. Idag är första krönikeboken. Man bara, vilken tråkig bok. Och så är det hur intressant som helst. Så jag bara, wow, det här var intressant. Och då kom det upp det här att Abraham, han hade ju sin andra son Isak. Han räknas ju som den viktigaste sen. Och samma sak med Isaks söner. Jakobs räknas som den viktigaste, den yngre sonen. Och sen Josefs söner. Jakobs söner så blir Josef viktigare än Ruben. Och sen Josefs söner så blir Efraim viktigare än Manasse. Alltså 4 generationer där den yngre går om den äldre. Och den har jag aldrig sett innan att det är 4 generationer.
Spännande ändå. Då blir det liksom som att det blir nya insikter även för en van bibelläsare att läsa igen på detta viset.
Mina föräldrar sa när jag var liten att men Bibeln den är så bra, man kan läsa den om och om igen och man hittar alltid något nytt. Ja, och nu har jag upptäckt detta.
Ja, men det är ju jättehärligt. Men hur funkar detta med läsningen? Sitter man och läser tillsammans då alla online? Eller man läser själv på sin kammare och rapporterar? Eller hur går det till rent praktiskt?
Vi har en hemsida där man skriver in, nu har jag läst det här och det här och det här. Och där ser man inte vem som har gjort vad. Men man ser hur många som har börjat den dagen och så man blir inspirerad av att det är fler. Ja. Men sen kan man skriva kommentarer i en Facebookgrupp och vad man upptäcker och så här. Så ja, det är inget krav någonstans utan allt är byggt på frivillighet. Men man liksom sporrar varandra och när jag har lovat de här att jag ska slutföra det här då plötsligt har jag en större incentive också att göra det.
Det kan jag förstå. Får man lite spark i baken kanske. Har du något särskilt så här medskick till de som lyssnar och tittar nu angående Bibel och inspiration att läsa Bibeln? Någonting du vill skicka med?
Testa att läsa en hel bok på en gång någon gång. För man ser helt andra grejer när man bara läser igenom och inte stannar upp hela tiden. Att stanna upp har sin tid, men att läsa rakt igenom har sin tid.
Ja. Tack, det tar jag till mig. Jag ska ta med mig det hem. Kanske läsa en bok ikväll. Kanske.
Ja, kanske.
Ja. Tack så jättemycket för att du ville vara med här och berätta om detta.
Tack så mycket, ha det så bra!
Detsamma och lycka till nu med bibelutmaningen. Hela vägen i mål.
Hela vägen.
Yay. Tack, ha det gott!
Det här programmet, BibelPodden, vill vi ha som en resurs till alla som vill fördjupa sig och lära mer om Bibeln. Och vi kan hjälpas åt att sprida det här programmet vidare. Dels kan du göra det genom att dela det och gilla det och prenumerera på de olika kanaler där det sänds. Men du kan också hjälpa oss genom att ge till det här projektet så att vi kan fortsätta att göra de här programmen och sprida dem fritt till så många som möjligt. Och då kommer det information här nedanför. Så kan du på olika sätt vara med och bidra och hjälpa till så att vi kan sända det här programmet så att Guds ord kan få gå ut till många i Sverige.
Ja, kul att höra vad han hade att säga om bibelutmaningen.
Absolut, och vad värdefullt är det där att tvinga sig själv att läsa en hel bok och läsa saker i sitt större sammanhang snarare än bara enskilda verser här och var.
Ja, men precis. Ibland kan det bli lite lösryckt och ibland blir det kanske korta stycken och man får ju ofta uppmaningen att stanna upp, låt verserna komma in, läs inte för långt. Men Jag får nog gå hem och läsa en hel bok ikväll.
Ja, men det här var en bra introduktion.
Ja.
Och idag ska vi prata om historietexter om Jesus. Evangelierna är de viktigaste källorna till Jesus. Men sen finns det ju andra som är skrivna av andra senare. De är inte lika viktiga som historiska källor, men den viktigaste som man brukar läsa är Josephus. Har du någon koll på Josephus?
Inte mycket.
Nej.
Jag är ju väldigt mycket här och nu, men jag har ju hört om honom och att du är bättre, du berättar.
Ja, han är ju kanske den viktigaste utombibliska källan till Jesus. Och han skriver inte mycket om Jesus. Han har andra gestalter från den judiska historien under första århundradet som han tycker är viktigare. En del av dem som nämns i Nya testamentet. Men han har skrivit ett kort stycke om Jesus som står i hans text Judiska fornminnen. Som kallas, och den här texten kallas för Testimonium Flavianum.
Just det.
För att han tog till namnet Flavius, Josephus, så Flavius vittnesmål. Det finns en Wikipedia-sida om den här texten som är enormt lång som den som vill kan fördjupa sig i.
Kan du förkorta den sidan i 3-4 ord? Sådär?
Ja, jag ska inte förkorta hela sidan, men jag kan läsa hela texten som den här texten handlar om Jesus. För den här diskuteras av forskare i långa stycken och avhandlingar och undersökningar. Vad säger han om Jesus? Vad kan vi lita på? Av en icke-kristen jude som hoppade av till romarna och sen skrev det judiska folkets historia. Jätteintressant.
Det är superspännande.
Men vad kan en icke-Jesustroende jude ha skrivit om Jesus? Vad är hans ord och är det någonting som kan inte betraktas som hans ord? Jag läser texten så kan vi få ta ställning till den.
Ja.
Ungefär vid denna tid uppträdde Jesus, en vis man, om det nu är tillbörligt att kalla honom en man. För han var en som gjorde förunderliga gärningar, en lärare för människor som gärna tar emot sanningen, och han drog till sig många, både judar och av grekiskt ursprung. Han var Messias. Och när Pilatus, på grund av en anklagelse från våra ledande män, dömde honom till korset, upphörde inte de som först hade älskat honom att göra det. Ty han visade sig för dem på den 3:e dagen levande igen, just som de gudomliga profeterna hade förutsagt dessa och 10 000 andra underbara ting om honom. Och ända till nu har de kristnas stam, uppkallade efter honom, inte dött ut. Det här är Josephus text om Jesus. Hur ska man se på det? Spontant sådär, vad känner du?
Spontant så låter det ju som att han beskriver Jesus som vi ser Jesus i Bibeln. Att han, om man nu kan kalla honom man, att han gjorde förunderliga ting. Så det stämmer ju överens med Bibelns Jesus, spontant.
För den stora frågan är ju då, kan en icke-Jesustroende jude ha skrivit så här? Eller låter det för hyllande?
Ja.
Är det så att senare kristna kopierare har lagt till en massa extra snälla saker om Jesus? Och här har forskarna brottats fram och tillbaka. Och nu har vi haft möjligheten att träffa en forskare som heter TC Schmidt. Han är amerikansk forskare och har skrivit en bok som heter Josephus and Jesus, utgiven på Oxford University Press. Det är ett jätteprestigefyllt förlag. Och han har fått väldigt hyllande kommentarer, även från kritiska forskare som säger, här har du upptäckt något intressant med den här texten. Och jag har haft förmånen att sitta här och intervjua honom.
Superspännande.
Ska vi gå på det och lyssna på vad han har att säga?
Ja, det gör vi.
Yes.
Det gör vi.
So now we are very honored to have you here as a guest on the Bible podcast. TC Schmidt, or do we call you Tom?
Oh, Tom is just fine. I'm glad to be here, Per.
So you're new to me, apart from your book, and I assume you're new to most listeners and viewers here in Sweden. So give us a little bit about your background. Who are you?
I'm a scholar of early Christianity and New Testament. I studied at Yale University, where I got my PhD. Right now, I'm a visiting fellow at Princeton University. I also have a post at Fairfield University. These are all in the northeastern United States. And I publish on all sorts of things. I publish on the historical Jesus. I publish on early Christian literature and apocalyptic literature. And I also publish on Eastern Christian literature, Christianity in Persia and the ancient Middle East. But this recent book of mine, of course, is on the historical Jesus and on what a particular ancient Jewish author has to say about Jesus.
Indeed. And in this podcast, we typically study the Bible. And when you use the term, the historical Jesus, what do scholars mean when they use that term?
That's a term that's been employed for several generations of scholarship, and it started as a sort of skeptical term. There were skeptical secular scholars that believed that the Gospels couldn't be taken on face value, and so they tried to develop methodologies to figure out what actually happened regarding Jesus of Nazareth. And this has been going on, this sort of quest for the historical Jesus in secular circles has been going on for decades and decades. And so when I say I study the historical Jesus, what I mean is that I publish in that field of secular studies on Jesus. I am a Christian myself, so I do believe the Gospels, but I also engage with these other questions that scholars have. And one thing that I do in my book is I bring forth new evidence for Jesus from outside the Bible that I think fascinatingly corroborates the gospel texts.
So when you began the quest, if we call it that, to investigate this testimonium from Josephus, what made you go into this big project?
First, let me say something about Josephus. Josephus is an ancient Jewish historian. He wrote around between the years 70 and 95 AD. And he was one of the finest historians the ancient world ever produced. He was born in Jerusalem in the 30s. He was an aristocrat, raised in Jerusalem, became a priest, became a Pharisee, became a diplomat, met with the Empress of Rome, became a general. He did so many things. And of course, he devoted the last 25 years of his life to writing history. In these historical books that he wrote, he reveals so much about the culture and background of the New Testament. If you read his writings, the names of biblical figures stream off his pages. People like Pontius Pilate and Herod the Great and Herod Agrippa and Herodias and Salome and all these people, Caiaphas the high priest, Gamaliel, the rabbi in the book of Acts. I was interested in Josephus because he also mentions Jesus. And if what he says about Jesus is authentic, then he would be the earliest non-Christian to discuss Jesus. So I thought, what better topic to look at to try and get another angle into the life of Jesus than this non-Christian Jewish historian from the first century.
Mm. And we're going to go into this quite short text in Josephus today, but he seems to be sometimes more interested in other biblical or New Testament characters like John the Baptist or James, the brother of Jesus. Is that so?
You're right to point this out. Josephus is very interested in political figures. And so any figure that has to do with politics, he spends much time on. He's also hesitant to talk about Jewish figures that are controversial to the Romans. So any Jewish false messiahs who led rebellions against Rome, he doesn't like to emphasize those things. He's writing at a time, his audience are Romans, and he wants the Romans to like the Jewish people. So he tends to avoid topics that he thinks his audience may not like. He loves John the Baptist. He loves John the Baptist very much. And like you said, he talks about John more than he does Jesus, although what he says about Jesus is much more impressive than what he says about John the Baptist, even though what he says is more limited about Jesus. So the explanation for why he speaks about Jesus not quite as much as other figures is that he usually avoids religious disputes, and especially when those are controversial to the Romans. We know that Christianity was controversial, and he probably wouldn't want any of the bad things Romans said about Christians to reflect on Jews.
Now, we have read through the text in the Testimonium Flavianum in Swedish to the viewers and listeners already. And let me repeat your main conclusion, as I understand it from your book. This testimonium was indeed composed by Josephus, a man who actually knew those who put Jesus and the apostles on trial. It hence offers remarkable insight into both the Jesus of history and the early Christian movement. I assume you still stand by your conclusion?
Yes. Yes, I do.
But when you presented this, I assume that it had met other scholars who have said, we are surprised by your conclusions, we would debate your conclusion. What have the reactions been?
I thought the same thing. I thought that scholars would be very skeptical of my conclusions and hostile. I've been surprised. They have been quite enthusiastic in general. Already some peer reviews are coming out of the book, and they tend to be positive. I did a book panel at the Society of Biblical Literature where there were 4 esteemed scholars who spent 2.5 hours going over my book, and 2 of them appeared to have been persuaded by my argument for authenticity, and the other 2 thought that the passage was much more authentic than they previously had imagined it to be. I count that as a great victory. The background to this is that as the passage is normally translated, it sounds amazingly pro-Christian. It sounds so pro-Christian that it feels like no non-Christian Jew could or would have ever said anything like this. You know, the passage is often translated as affirming that Jesus was resurrected, that he was the Christ, and so on. My argument is twofold. My argument is, number one, when you look at the style of the passage, the style matches Josephus. It sounds like him. There's nothing suspicious about the words and phrases. They all sound like they come from Josephus. The second argument is that when you look at where Josephus uses the same words and phrases elsewhere, remarkably, he doesn't seem to use those words and phrases very positively. He uses them negatively or neutrally or ambiguously. What this means is that the passage has been over-translated. It's not this positive statement about Jesus. It's much more neutral or ambiguous. And when you give a properly contextualized translation, then all the objections to the passage's authenticity fall away.
And I have to admit, I was a bit skeptical when I first heard about your book, and I thought, just like I assume most historians would have thought, that it sounds a bit speculative to make him reason as a Christian. But he wasn't a Christian. He was a Jew.
Correct. Yes, he was a very faithful Jew who did not believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And I think properly understood, this is evident in the passage itself. I'll give you some examples. The passage usually says that Jesus wrought, he was a doer of miracles. And I don't know about Swedish, but in English, miracles is a very positive term.
Indeed.
When you look at the original Greek, it turns out Greek has a lot of words for miracles. And the original Greek word is paradoxa, which actually is kind of suspicious. It's something that pertains to supernatural works of unknown origin. Are they demonic? Are they malevolent? Are they divine? It's unclear where these are coming from. In English, we would say paranormal. They're paranormal deeds, things that just... So all of a sudden, if you plug that understanding in, that particular word is no longer positive. It's a little ambiguous, it's neutral. And the same goes for many other parts of the passage, where if you compare them to Josephus's writings elsewhere, these same words and phrases just don't come off positively. I'll give you one more quick example. Usually the passage is translated as saying that Jesus was in fact resurrected. Jesus appeared to the disciples 3 days alive again. But when you look at the original Greek, it's clear that that's not what Josephus means. When he uses this word appear elsewhere, which is the Greek word phainomai, he really means seem. It seemed to the disciples that he was alive again after 3 days. In other words, Josephus is not claiming that Jesus was resurrected. He's claiming that the disciples thought that Jesus was resurrected. And of course, that sounds exactly like what an ancient non-Christian would say.
Yeah, precisely. Skeptical historians would say that the early disciples, they claimed that Jesus had appeared to them alive, which sounds pretty much what Josephus claims here.
Precisely, but I should caution that that's what ancient non-Christians said, but we operate in a world that in many respects is even more skeptical than the ancient non-Christians were. And so in that field of historical Jesus studies, there are many, many scholars that will not even acknowledge that the original disciples believed that Jesus was resurrected. They will deny that. And part of my work is showing that, oh, here we have a first century Jewish historian who says that the disciples did actually believe this. And I go on to argue in my book that Josephus actually knew men who put some of the disciples on trial. So he is a remarkably good source to know about what the disciples actually believed. In fact, Josephus's own commander in the Jewish war put James, the brother of Jesus, to death. So he has remarkable connections to the apostles, and what he has to tell us about what they believed is vitally important for our understanding of history.
There are several conclusions of yours that were new to me. For instance, that the manuscripts that we have from Josephus, I don't remember where they are from now, the oldest ones.
Yes. So in some sense, the works of Josephus have what we would call a normal textual history. The manuscripts that contain these works are from about the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries.
Right.
Josephus wrote in the 1st century, so that's about a 1,000-year gap. That sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's actually very, very normal. That's what most ancient documents, that's how most ancient documents are preserved.
But what is interesting here is that you refer to several authors who refer to Josephus before this time, Eusebius and Origen and others.
Precisely. So we also have other textual witnesses from the authors you name, from these other early authors who quote from passages of Josephus. And we also have very ancient translations in other languages like Latin and Syriac, Armenian, Arabic, that preserve the Testimonium Flavianum, this passage about Jesus. And when you add all of those textual witnesses together, translations, quotations, extracts, and manuscripts, we actually have extremely impressive manuscript tradition of this passage about Jesus.
And what I found interesting is that when you analyze their discussions on Josephus, they don't question the points that we find perhaps strange about miracles and about resurrection. They question other, what we would consider minor details. Is that so?
Yes, that's right. That was one of the things that surprised me, that when you look at how ancient writers interpreted Josephus's words, they do not seem to follow how regular scholars interpret them. They don't point out all of these extraordinary things that Josephus apparently says. Instead, they point out much more mundane things like the number of Jesus's disciples and Jewish culpability in the death of Jesus, or the content of Jesus's teaching, or the time in which Jesus ministered. And this happens again and again and again. And I use that phenomenon, that pattern of interpretation, to argue that scholars are misinterpreting this passage, that the reason why they're not pointing out these extraordinary things is because they're reading the passage differently. These are authors who know Greek as a native language, and they interpret this passage differently, and I think we should be interpreting it differently as well.
Yeah, and I'd say that strengthens the case to say that they would not view his writings on the resurrection or the appearances and the miracles as controversial.
Yes. So in the ancient world, it was very common, extremely common, for non-Christians to admit that Jesus worked miracles. We have many examples of this. However, it would be strange for them to say certain things like the resurrection and things like that. And the argument I'm making is that Josephus doesn't actually affirm that Jesus was the Christ or was resurrected. Instead, his words are being misinterpreted, but early authors knew this. They properly interpreted the passage so that they knew Josephus wasn't saying these extraordinary things. They knew that he was just affirming the disciples believed these things. He does affirm that Jesus worked miracles, but to them that wasn't particularly noteworthy because that wasn't a debate. Almost all ancient non-Christians who talk about Jesus say he worked miracles. So that wasn't something that they thought was particularly impressive.
So I understand you as confirming almost the whole Testimonium Flavianum as authentic, apart from the writing that we understand it, or him writing that Jesus was the Christ, but rather that he was thought to be or was called the Christ or something like that. Why is that so?
Per, it's good for you to specify that. It depends what you mean when you say authentic. If you're speaking only about the continuous manuscripts of Josephus's works, then I do think a phrase has dropped out. So instead of saying Josephus saying Jesus was the Christ, I think he said Jesus was thought to be the Christ. However, if you factor in other textual witnesses from quotations, ancient translations, extracts, things like that, then this phrase is not lost. This phrase is present in an ancient Latin translation. It's present in an ancient Syriac translation, and with other Armenian and Arabic witnesses. And in my discipline, we call this textual criticism. And this is just normal textual criticism where scholars gather all the textual witnesses. So if you gather all the textual witnesses, then we haven't lost the passage. And so I think that the Latin and Syriac translations witness to what the original actually was.
And I think this is fascinating that you just don't draw the conclusions based on wild speculations, but that you actually go into all the texts that we have, the manuscripts to Josephus himself, the ancient translations, the other ancient writers who refer to Josephus. And I think this is a very valid way of doing history.
I hope so. So far, scholars have been appreciating my methodology because I combine reception history, how the ancients read the passage, but also stylistic analysis. And I do some very complicated analyses at times where I draw from large databases. And I use both those disciplines, reception analysis and stylometric analysis, to paint this picture of what this passage is actually telling us.
Yeah, and this is interesting and fascinating. And those who are interested in looking into the details, I could recommend to go to the book, which is called
Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ.
Indeed. So when we look at the sources that Josephus mentions, we might consider Josephus as being apart from the New Testament tradition and history. But who would you say are his main sources, and how close are they to Jesus and the trial of Jesus?
Yes, most people, when they imagine Josephus, they think of just a random person living in the Roman Empire. He's from the 1st century, which is good. He's fairly close to the time of Jesus, but he's just living in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is a big place. It turns out, though, that this is not the case. Josephus was born and raised in Jerusalem. And I show in part 2 of my book that he knows many people who were well acquainted with Jesus or the apostles or the early Jesus movement. I've mentioned some of these before. His commander, and this is his direct military commander in the Jewish war, had James, the brother of Jesus, executed and put to death. And this caused such an upheaval, Josephus tells us, that his commander lost the high priesthood. He was removed from the high priesthood by the Romans and by the Jewish king for doing this. So this was not just some minor hit from like a mafia figure who's going to forget who he happened to kill. This was probably the most terrible consequence of this man's life. And he would remember James, the brother of Jesus. So Josephus also knows members of the Herodian dynasty. He knows Herod Agrippa II. He seems to know the son of Salome, the girl who danced for the head of John the Baptist. He knows the son of Rabbi Gamaliel. Rabbi Gamaliel is at the trial of the apostles in the book of Acts, probably at the trial of Jesus himself. I go through 10, 11 names of people whom Josephus knew, whom we can place either in Jerusalem during the crucifixion of Jesus, or we can place as associated with those who were there. And this would give Josephus remarkable access to information about Jesus. Let me just share the most remarkable connection. The most remarkable connection is The man I mentioned before, Josephus's commander, his name was Ananus II. Ananus II, as I mentioned, had James, the brother of Jesus, executed. Ananus II was also the brother-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas and the son of the high priest Annas. Both of them had Jesus put to death. So Josephus knew the man whose father and brother-in-law put Jesus to death. This is a remarkable connection to the Jesus of history.
Indeed. And we are very, very close to the events themselves, rather than other figures in ancient history where the sources are written several centuries afterwards. This is not a mythological tradition. This is actual history made by the people who were actually involved, and you can ask themselves.
Precisely, yes. And I argue in my book that Josephus's commander, Ananus II, that not only did he know family members who put Jesus to death, but that he himself was probably at the trial of Jesus personally. And we know this for several reasons. But Josephus then would actually know someone who was at the trial of Jesus. Mm.
So would you say that the New Testament, the Gospels, the letters and the other texts, and Josephus, they corroborate each other, they confirm each other and help each other out in writing history?
Absolutely, yes. The four Gospels complement one another, but Josephus complements them. He illuminates their background in many, many ways. For instance, he corroborates and also illuminates. So for instance, he corroborates by, for example, saying that Jesus was accused by, in Josephus's words, the first men among us before Pontius Pilate. That corroborates what the Gospels say, that the Jewish religious leadership went and accused Jesus before Pontius Pilate. But Josephus also illuminates the New Testament background. You know, when Jesus is approached by the religious leaders and he's asked about taxes, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? You get the sense maybe that there's some background to this question, and Josephus explains it, that taxes were an item of great controversy in first century Judaism, and there were uprisings over taxes. So when Jesus was asked this question, it was a loaded question. There's many examples of this where Josephus will help explain some of the biblical text to us.
Mm. So when we began, we talked about the discipline of the historical Jesus. Would you say that this text and other material in Josephus, they adds to the understanding of the historical Jesus?
I think so, absolutely. I say in my book that the outline that Josephus gives us regarding the life and ministry of Jesus follows the outline of what we find in the Gospels. He was a Jewish rabbi who was known for being a teacher. He had many disciples. He worked miracles or paranormal deeds, supernatural deeds, that he was called the Christ, that at the accusation of the Jewish leaders, he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and his disciples claimed that he was raised from the dead 3 days later in fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. That follows the outline that we find in the four Gospels. And this is not the outline that is agreed to by many skeptical scholars, but I think that we can now affirm from this independent, non-Christian, first-century Jewish source that, yes, this does seem to be the outline of Jesus's life.
Yeah, this is very interesting because several skeptics, they claim that these are later exaggerations, that Jesus was a miracle worker or risen from the dead. And originally we had this story about the humble Jesus. How do you view these claims by skeptics?
I think it's incontrovertible that Jesus was known as a miracle worker during his ministry. There are even now some non-Christian scholars that will admit this, that yes, being known as a miracle worker was something that was present in his lifetime. I also think that the report of Jesus being resurrected was not something that took years or generations to develop and was sort of later exaggerations. Josephus tells us that on the third day, it seemed to the disciples that Jesus was alive again. And I think what Josephus is doing here is he's saying that they believed this on the third day after Jesus' death. That's where this belief came from. So that story of this legendary development of Jesus' resurrection, I think, is not something that is tenable, given the evidence that Josephus gives. I think it's a belief that developed on day 3 after the crucifixion of Jesus.
And you make a final point saying that scholars have for too long dismissed the value of Josephus' Testimonium Flavianum. Do you have a hope that it will be sort of upgraded in the academic and popular discussion in the understanding of the historical Jesus?
I hope so. That's my hope in writing the book. As I mentioned earlier, there have been some reviews that have been coming in, and they've largely been positive. That I have seen to have moved the ball forward, so to speak, in terms of authenticity. But we'll see. It's still early days. You know, it usually takes years for scholars to digest things and take things into account. But my hope is that eventually the field will turn to treat the Testimonium Flavianum as authentic and as a very valuable witness to the Jesus of history.
Yes, indeed. And you make a final wording about saying that we must follow the evidence. Is it possible that the understanding of Josephus and early Christianity and of Jesus have, for several scholars, been led by personal convictions or feelings or emotions or general skepticism, rather than following the evidence, and that it's the New Testament history is becoming more based on the actual evidence?
Per, I think so. We always have to be careful when we're doing intellectual investigations that we follow the evidence. And this is something that for every question, both sides of the question can fall victim to by relying on your emotions, your hopes, your biases. I came into writing this book believing the regular belief. I thought that the Testimonium Flavianum had been corrupted by later Christians. But I changed my mind, and I changed it because of the evidence, both the reception history, how early writers did not seem to read the passage the way scholars did, and the stylometric analysis. It was overwhelming to me. So I think that skeptical scholars have had knee-jerk reactions to the idea. You know, they've been so allergic to the idea of, for instance, supernatural deeds that they won't even believe that an ancient person believed it about Jesus. And I think that is just simply far too skeptical. I think the evidence that people contemporary with Jesus believed that he worked miracles is incontrovertible. And he was known as a miracle worker, and it was something that even very hostile skeptics admitted that he did. But they found other explanations, that he was working with demons or things like that. You read this in the New Testament, you read it outside the New Testament as well.
Yeah. And when we have concluded reading your very thorough study, you sort of leave it to other scholars and to general readers, to the origins of Christianity and to the one called Christ. Is that how you should do as a historian? You give them the evidence and then give the sort of understanding and the personal reflections back to the reader.
Yes, I'm writing an academic book here, and I am a Christian, I am a follower of Jesus, but I don't want those beliefs to be injected into this book. If I write another book that's for a Christian audience, I might do something like that. But I think that we should not hold the personal beliefs of scholars against them. I think we should just evaluate the evidence that they present. Something I would caution your viewers is that if you're intellectually investigating something and the only argument against whatever you're investigating is simply the personal beliefs of an opponent, that's not based on evidence. You have to look at what the opposition is actually claiming. So I would ask your viewers to do the same with my book. And I hope to do the same with other scholarly responses. If scholars are skeptical, I want to look at the evidence they provide. So I leave it to the audience, the readership of my book, to make the final conclusions for themselves.
Well, Tom, I think you have made a very valuable contribution to the historical understanding of New Testament history and to Jesus himself. So thank you very much for this book, and thank you very much for participating in the Bible podcast.
Per, it was a delight to be here. Thank you so much.
Det här var ju spännande att höra på alltså.
Verkligen. Tänk att få höra en seriös kompetent historiker som utvärderar bevisningen både inom Bibeln och utanför Bibeln om Jesus som historisk person.
Men då kan vi kan ju tro att det här är sant då. Då är det ju det. Det känns ju väldigt väl belagt.
Ja, och det fantastiska är ju att det är inte de utombibliska texterna som är de viktiga om Jesus. De kompletterar och bekräftar det som står i Bibeln. Men de viktigaste källorna är ju de som vi har i Nya testamentet.
Ja, men det är alltid roligt om det utombibliska också bekräftar det.
Och det här var dagens fördjupning i texter utanför Bibeln som också bekräftar Bibeln. Nästa vecka tänkte vi dyka på djupet i en annan typ av text.
Ja, det blir spännande.
Ja, en text som vi kanske inte alltid kan berömma i alla avseenden, nämligen Koranen. Koranen ger en massa anspråk om att beskriva bibliska händelser. Frågan är vad man kan lita på i jämförelse med Bibeln. Så det här var dagens avsnitt av BibelPodden och vi återkommer nästa vecka med nya intressanta program.